everyone from the wonderful city of Manchester, England. It's not raining. I take that as a victory. Good evening to those of you at the other side of the world, Roz. And I'm not sure how I follow from that, to be honest, Roz. Like, it was fantastic. Everything you said, I subscribe by. I think Taron would reply, oh, but feminist scholarship was not one of my, objectives, one of my targets. But I absolutely agree with you that actually it becomes a target, and what you say is it was just spotless about, methodological rigor, about transparency. It was. Thank you for that, Ross. That was really fantastic. So what I will try to do is to try perhaps also, to offer a perspective that we could say it's complementary in some respects. And it starts from a consideration of the beginnings of this scholarly activism debate. As far as I can trace, the beginning of the debate was an article published by Jan Komarek, who's professor in Copenhagen on the European Constitutional Law Review, called Freedom and Power of European Constitutional Scholarship, in which basically Komarek criticizes, among other people, some of our Polish colleagues for the way that they reacted and embrace constitutional activism vis-a-vis the PSI party during the 8 years they were in power there. There were then a series of blogs engaging with this. One was the one that, and by the way, Maria and David, thank you so much for the invitation. I forgot to say, I really appreciate it, and to be in the panel with Leora and Roz, it's amazing, honestly, so thank you. There were a number of blogs, including from Andras Jakab. You can see it there at the lower end of the slide. And basically, both Komarek and Jakab said, that constitutional scholars should not be activists. Komarek goes through a very a kind of theoretical route, says that, he subscribed by the view of scholarship as the pursuit of truth put forward by Stanley Fish some 30, 40 years ago. Then Jakab actually says something interesting. What should a constitutional scholar do in a time of autocratizing country, in a time of, when democratic values are in the retreat? And Jakab says, well, the most you can do is in your teaching, you can make some very, very blunt, in-passing references, but nothing that can suscitate, the discussion. You need to be basically super neutral. This is the most you can do, some passing references in your teaching. And if you think about the way in which our Israeli colleagues instead reacted to the proposed judicial reforms by the Netanyahu government in the last 2 years, these are the opposite end of the spectrum, basically. So my argument is to support the idea that constitutional scholar must be activist, but it comes from a different perspective, I guess. It's not an argument that it's based on deontological, methodological considerations, but it's basically based on what it means to be a constitutional scholar in a regime of entrenched constitutionalism. And this argument has been put forward originally by Luigi Ferrajoli. Some of you in the room might know him. Ferrajoli is one of the most important Italian legal and political philosophers. He is very well known in most Latin language speaking countries, so where Italian is spoken, Portuguese, Spanish. Ferrajoli is really not that well known yet in Anglo-American scholarship, and one of the things that I try to do with my own work is trying to make his ideas accessible to Anglo-American colleagues who might not speak either Spanish, Italian, or Portuguese, or French. I think some Ferrajoli works have been translated in French as well. And one of the main things that Ferrajoli does in his work is to distinguish between what he calls the rule of law state and the constitutional rule of law state. The rule of law state, in a nutshell, is the state that basically was present, especially in European continental countries, until the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, so to speak. Apologies, that's the door buzzer, of course. Ferrajoli, in this respect, basically explained that in the rule of law state, legality is the highest principle when it comes to lawmaking. So basically, everything must go through the form of the law. Everything must be approved by the body that is designed to do so, most likely a parliament. Sorry about that. I'm hoping that my wife might be able to get it. If not, I might have to...
we can fill in for you. Go for it.
Just give me a sec. Let me just check. I really apologize. We have a 3-month baby, so just give me a second. Sorry.
So for some in the room, we met Paolo during the summer at ICON, during the ICON conference, and he was still a dad-to-be, and now he is officially a dad with his 3-month-old baby.
Sorry, everyone. These are the complications.
Don't worry, Paolo. You're fine. Don't worry.
Of new parents, first-time parents. Here it is. Anyway, so what I was saying is that in the rule of law state, basically everything can run through legality, absolutely. And in this respect, it means that there are no internal limits to what can be legal. The only possible critique of law is an external one, a moral, political, and so forth. Ferrajoli contrasts the rule of law state with the constitutional rule of law state. The constitutional rule of state occurs when entrenched constitutions, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, so modern entrenched constitutions appear and progressively become the norm, basically, in constitutional law. And the real paradigmatic change in this respect is that now legislation is not, legality is not the highest principle in the legal system, because even legislation, which used to be at the top of the hierarchy of sources, is now constrained by constitutional norms and principles. The interesting point for us, and this is a slight theoretical point, but that in the rule of law state, there was no possibility for conflicts between legislation. Why? Because basically due to the operation of the lex posteriors and lex specialis criteria, conflicts would not arise. So basically, if there was a new piece of legislation that was in conflict with the previous one, there would be no conflict eventually, automatically, because the new piece of legislation would be given priority vis-a-vis the previous one. And so if there was a more specific piece of legislation vis-a-vis a more general one. So there was no possibility of normative conflicts in the rule of state. In the constitutionalism, this is completely different, because now there is indeed the possibility that legislation might be in violation of the Constitution, either because legislation is in conflict with one of the constitutional norms, or because legislation does not implement something that the Constitution guarantees, for instance, the right to health or the right to housing or something like that. The important point is that the existence of these conflicts, these potential conflicts, is what makes a difference for the constitutional scholar. Why? Because in this respect, then, every legal phenomenon in our modern entrenched constitutional system is at the same time a fact and a norm, and should be understood simultaneously as both. The distinction by Kelsen, in which you would have legal science as a normative science, and then you would have sociology of law as a completely different enterprise, is untenable. In this respect, we must consider of legal science as both, at the same time, a normative and a realistic sociological enterprise. This means, in other words, for the constitutional scholars, that it is not enough for constitutional scholars to describe a conflict between legislation and the Constitution, or to identify a gap between the Constitution and legislation. If constitutional scholars take the normativity of Constitution seriously, they must denounce those conflicts and gaps as something that needs to be remedied. It's not anymore to describe them. If you take the Constitution seriously, and the constitutional ought in particular, the normativity of the Constitution seriously, then you must ask for those conflicts and gaps to be remedied. By whom? By the institutions that are entitled to do so. A constitutional court, a Supreme Court, depending on the structure of the jurisdictions. In other words, in my view, if Ferrajoli is right, and if the argument about the paradigm change that the constitutional rule of law state brings is correct, the constitutional rule of law state requires scholars to be critical, requires scholars to be activists, not just in their writing, but in their teaching as well. It is not enough to show students to describe that there is a conflict. The constitutional scholar must say that that conflict must be resolved by the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court, or whoever institution might be entitled to do so. This is a paper, basically, that it's been a work in progress for some time now, and in the second part of the paper, and I will just give you a flavor of this, I basically identify two potential issues, though, for this position. This is a position, by the way, that I completely subscribe to. I think this is correct. I think this is the way in which constitutional scholars should understand their own role and their own deontological obligations within a regime of entrenched constitutionalism. But there are two issues here. One issue is internal to Ferrajoli's theory. Ferrajoli famously says that his theory of law is a formal theory, that it doesn't tell us anything about the content of individual legal system, but it's all about the relationship between the different components of the theory. The problem with this is that that doesn't seem to apply to the notion of constitution. In other words, would Ferrajoli say that constitutional scholars must implement the constitution, so to speak, if that constitution were to be fundamentally illiberal? I personally don't think so. So to me, this points to the fact that maybe the notion of constitution is inherently, in some sense, the liberal democratic one. There cannot be such a thing as a fundamentally illiberal constitution. And this speaks to a famous argument, for instance, put forward by Robert Alexy on the dual nature of law. And I think that once understood in this way, the argument makes sense. There is something about constitutions that maybe distinguishes them in this respect from ordinary legislation. And then the second issue that I identify for this approach to constitutional scholarship, and this is an issue that is not just internal to Ferrajoli's theory but applies across the board, is what should constitutional scholars do vis-a-vis unconstitutional constitutional amendments? In some respect, unconstitutional amendments are almost a contradiction in terms, because on the one hand, constitutional amendments are supposedly approved through the process and the procedures authorized by the Constitution. So in one sense, they are eminently constitutional, but at the same time, they might be approved with the purpose of dismantling one or more of the rules and principles that make the Constitution what it is, one of those liberal or democratic principles. They might be approved to reduce judicial independence, for instance. In the Israeli case, just to mention the latest example. And so I haven't figured out quite yet an answer to this last problem. I think that this is quite complex, but generally speaking, I would basically say that it very much depends on context. So to conclude, one way in which I hope that this argument might be interesting for the discussion taking place at the conference is that I believe that the question of what the constitutional scholar should do and whether or not they should be activists is heavily context dependent as well. And so how a constitutional scholar should behave in France, vis-a-vis in Italy, vis-a-vis in the UK, vis-a-vis in the US, might have a slightly different answer. Again, apologies for the interruption, and thank you so much again for the attention and the invitation. Thank you.